Greetings. My name is Stan Prager from the Regarp book blog, www.regarp.com. Today's podcast features my review of The President and the Assassin, McKinley, Terror, and Empire at the Dawn of the American Century by Scott Miller. Noted biographer David Herbert Donald, confident in his conviction that Abraham Lincoln's character was defined by what he styled as his essential passivity, was to take him at his word in an 1864 letter, in which the then president alleged that "I claim not to have controlled events, but confess plainly that events have controlled me." That someone of Donald's stature could be so utterly deceived by Lincoln's celebrated acumen for spinning different yarns for assorted audiences simply astonished me. While I bristled quietly, acclaimed Lincoln scholars objected both audibly and vehemently, and do so to this day. But if ever there truly was a passive occupant of the White House driven almost entirely by outside events, it was the William McKinley that emerges in The President and the Assassin, McKinley, Terror, and Empire at the Dawn of the American Century by international correspondent Scott Miller, a fast-paced, well-written portrait of America in the final years of the 19th century, burdened by one of the most ill-conceived and awkward titles in recent memory. McKinley, the mild-mannered, pro-business 25th president, is largely remembered, when he is remembered at all, for his assassination at the turn of the century, which catapulted his far more colorful and politically progressive vice president, Theodore Roosevelt, into executive office. Yet, it was McKinley who presided over a newly expansionist America's initial violent baby steps towards a global presence in its first significant act of overseas aggression, the Spanish-American War of 1898. But here, too, McKinley was upstaged by Roosevelt, who in his then role as Assistant Secretary of the Navy helped instigate the war, and then famously led his Rough Riders on charges of Kettle and San Juan Hills in Cuba. Meanwhile, McKinley spent much of his time quietly vacillating over policy, when not tending to his sickly, likely hypochondriac wife Ida. McKinley, who was quite popular and even beloved, won re-election in a landslide, but his second term was abruptly cut short by bullets fired by anarchist Leon Czolgosz during his attendance at the Pan American Exposition in Buffalo, New York on September 6, 1901. He died of his wounds 1 week later. Those who turn to The President and the Assassin for a focus upon McKinley's untimely end may be disappointed, because despite the title, this incident represents only a small slice of the narrative. But that turns out to be just as well, because Miller instead serves up a much wider menu that ranges from the explosive expansion of the American economy fueled by industrialism and innovation, the roots and endurance of labor unrest, the related growth of political radicalism and its sometime close cousin anarchism, and Washington's lust to join the other Western powers in an orgy of imperialism that included the peaceful annexation of Hawaii, along with the ill-begotten gains from the war with Spain that added Guam, Puerto Rico, and the Philippines as overseas territories, while asserting an open-door right to access Chinese markets. Each of these topics merits a book-length treatment, but Miller succeeds in blending these themes and much more into a fascinating and immensely readable account of disparate forces that coalesced to shape the nation as the 19th century drew to a close. The post-Reconstruction Republican Party largely abandoned African Americans in their struggle for civil rights, while embracing big business and pro-growth policies that in an era lacking any real regulation created enormous wealth for some, while tethering the welfare of masses of wage workers, many of them immigrants, to the whims of the few who controlled factories, mills, mining, and other industries. The vast economic inequality that characterized the Gilded Age bred deep resentment and anger among the working class, who found themselves paid a pittance of near-starvation wages while compelled to labor long hours in often unsafe conditions and liable to be fired at a moment's notice if they advanced even the slightest objection. The protectionism in vogue at the time, McKinley made his political career championing tariffs, kept prices high even when wages arbitrarily fell. The law favored business and their captains of industry, such that the attempts of organized labor to improve their lot were frequently crushed with the support and active participation of the police and the military, leaving workers dead, imprisoned, or unemployed, even blackballed from being rehired ever again. McKinley, who many years earlier served pro bono as counsel for striking miners, as president demonstrated little concern for the plight of workers, but he was, as the author emphasizes, consumed with the growing problem of overproduction that was threatening the nation's long-term economic health. In short, the buying power of the population of the United States could not support purchasing the amount of goods that factories were churning out. Rather than producing less, As the typical capitalist supply and demand economic imperative would dictate, manufacturers kept up a frenetic pace of increased supply, cutting wages by caprice to increase profitability. It was this dilemma that got the president to shift his gaze overseas. If cutting production was unthinkable, perhaps expanding the market for American goods to foreign shores would do the trick. And it was that notion that saw McKinley, a Civil War veteran who had witnessed enough bloodletting in his time to enter office firmly resistant to any kind of jingoist adventurism, begin to temper that opposition, even as larger events presented a convenient opportunity to do so. Those events centered around the ongoing guerrilla war in Cuba by insurgents seeking the island's independence from Spain. Americans were generally sympathetic to the rebels and eager to see the Spanish driven from the hemisphere. In 1897, McKinley even offered to purchase Cuba, but was rebuffed by Spain. When the U.S. battleship Maine exploded for unknown reasons and sank while docked at Havana Harbor in February 1898, forces were set in motion that would lead to war. At first, McKinley sought a diplomatic solution, but he also dithered, while others, especially Roosevelt, lobbied for aggressive action. Finally, McKinley's longing for foreign markets for American goods aligned with the pleadings of those who urged him to act in the national interest, and a shooting war was on. The once mighty Spain fell rapidly to American firepower on land and at sea. The United States acquired Guam, Puerto Rico, and the Philippines. Cuba was granted its independence as such, even as it fell under the thumb of U.S. domination for 6 decades to come. The real war, with Filipino guerrillas seeking their own sovereignty, had just begun, and was put down brutally by the United States. Later termed the Philippine-American War, it resulted in the deaths of over 200,000 civilians. While Miller's coverage here generally deserves high marks, he tends to be far too sympathetic to American objectives and little dwells upon the terrible atrocities committed by U.S. forces in the process of pacifying the Philippines. For that, the reader must turn elsewhere. Meanwhile, as attempts at organized labor fizzled and union busting went unpunished, more radical politics began to inform the disenfranchised seeking some form of satisfaction. At the fringes were anarchists like Emma Goldman, who preached against any form of authority, a message that resonated among some sectors of the oppressed. Still, the powers that be feared anarchism far out of proportion to its actual influence. I've often compared George W. Bush's vague, ill-judged war on terror with comparable efforts against anarchism back in the day. Since neither jihadist nor anarchist can commonly be identified with any formal organization, attacking each with all forces at your disposal amounts to little more than punching at paper bags in a darkened room, with similar results. Chicago's Haymarket Affair, now recalled as the origin of International Workers' Day, began as a peaceful assembly in support of a workers' strike that turned violent when police interceded, and a bomb was thrown by an individual who was never identified. 8 anarchists were arrested, and 4 were hanged, including the well-known activist Albert Parsons, even though there remains no evidence any were involved with the bombing, while the responsibility for the deaths of nearly a dozen at Haymarket were likely the result of police gunfire. But there was indeed also an authentic violent streak in anarchism. In the 2 decades leading up to McKinley's assassination, anarchists murdered the Russian Tsar, the President of France, the Spanish Prime Minister, the Austro-Hungarian Empress, and the King of Italy. It was Czolgosz's turn next, but in Miller's characterization, he comes across as the unlikeliest of assassins. A lazy, aimless, disaffected, and socially awkward loner, his passion for ideology seemed to come in a far distant second to his desperation for finding a place to fit in. Instead, it cost him his life. Still asserting that he acted in support of the working man, he was swiftly tried and executed in the electric chair only 45 days after McKinley succumbed to his wounds. Presidential biographies are a favorite genre. I found The President and the Assassin on the shelves of my personal library shortly after reading 2 books on James A. Garfield back to back, including Candace Millard's Destiny of the Republic, which is devoted to Garfield's long, excruciating death from gunshot wounds. McKinley and Garfield had much in common. Both were Civil War generals, both mourned the loss of young children, both were Republican politicians, highly regarded by their peers who advanced to the presidency. Also, tragically, both fell to an assassin's bullets, almost exactly 20 years apart to the very month. Unlike Lincoln and JFK, who were shot in the head, both Garfield and McKinley suffered injuries to the torso that need not have been fatal. Garfield, whose wounds were probed with unwashed fingers, lived an agonizing 79 days before dying of the resulting infection. Medical care had improved dramatically since Garfield's day, but it did not save McKinley, who mercifully only lingered for a week, but yet died of gangrene. While it was perhaps a morbid fascination with McKinley's end that first brought me to The President and the Assassin, the book turned out to have far more to offer. I want to believe that the ungainly title was forced upon Miller by an editor eager for book sales, who either disregarded or disdained the author's intended audience, but it certainly shortchanged the value of this book, which deserves not only a better title, but an expanded readership. I highly recommend it. Thank you for joining me for today's podcast. I encourage you to share it in your network. Many more reviews and an eclectic array of fiction and nonfiction books are available at regarp.com and regarpbookblogpod.com. Have a great day.